guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. I only have a short frame of time where my house is going to be quiet enough for me to film this video, so let's just get right into it. Today we are going to be talking about the very strange case of a man by the name of Johnathan Luna. Johnathan was born on October 21st, 1965 in the Bronx in New York. The area where he grew up had a very high crime rate. It was known to be a high drug use kind of area, but despite all of this and his surroundings, Johnathan always knew what he wanted in life. He always had big dreams, big ambitions, and he was going to do whatever it took to get there. He was really serious about his education, and he was just a really dedicated, hardworking young man. And that did end up paying off later in his life, because Johnathan, now being 38 years old, was living in Maryland, working in Baltimore, and living in Elkridge with his wife and 2 children. He worked in Baltimore as an assistant attorney, and Johnathan was very good at his job, but he usually worked the more serious cases. And it is said that attorneys who work these serious cases usually aren't the happiest, but Johnathan was not like that. Everybody who knew him said that he was always happy. He never seemed like a grumpy old attorney. He was really easy to talk to, and he was a very well-liked man in both his outside of work life as well as his work life. So he was just overall a well-liked, happy-go-lucky kind of guy. Because he was so well-liked, it was absolutely shocking to everyone when on December 4th, 2003, the body of Johnathan Luna was found, deceased with 36 stab wounds. The importance of this case all starts on December 3rd, 2003. Johnathan had a fairly normal day, or he planned for that day to be fairly normal, I should say. He woke up in the morning and left his home in Elkridge to head to Baltimore. He was in court that day, and he was very busy because he was working a case where 2 men were involved in running a drug ring out of a music studio. Once he was finished being in court that day, he then headed to his office to work on a plea deal. Before I move on further in this video, I do want to talk about the case that Johnathan was working on. Like I briefly already mentioned, this case was very complicated. It involved 2 men who were running a drug ring out of a music studio, and it was just a really heavy, complicated case. So let me try and explain this case to the best of my understanding, because again, like I've already mentioned several times, this particular case was very complicated. So again, there were 2 men who were running a drug ring out of a music studio, but this case was more complicated than that because the FBI was heavily involved in this case. The reason that they were heavily involved is because one of the 2 men that was on trial was an FBI informant. Now, in this case, it did involve a drug-related murder as well as several other things that were highly illegal. And so this informant was said to be working for the FBI. And while working for the FBI, he was suspected of committing a murder. He was selling drugs, using drugs, doing a lot of very illegal things. And it is said that the FBI might have just been turning a blind eye to all of this so that he would continue to be an informant for them. So obviously this case is very complicated. The FBI had a lot of things that they were trying to cover up within the case, and that just made it that much more confusing because obviously the FBI is a very powerful bureau in the crime world. So still on December 3rd, now Johnathan is back in his office, and while he was in the office, this is when he decided to call a defense attorney. This was around 9:30, and the defense attorney did not answer the phone, but basically Johnathan left him a voicemail saying that it was getting late, he had been working on the plea deal, but it wasn't done, and he had to go home, so he was going to take the plea deal home with him and work on it and then return it the following morning. A few hours after getting off the phone with this attorney is when Johnathan had finally left his office, and while he was leaving the office, he left behind his cell phone as well as his glasses, which we'll come back to talk about in just a minute. So now let's kind of talk about what happened after Johnathan left his office. So this is immediately where things start to get strange. Obviously, it's very weird that he left his glasses and his cell phone behind. I feel like especially nowadays, people don't usually go anywhere without their cell phones. However, Johnathan needed his glasses to see in order to drive, so he really couldn't drive without his glasses. But anyway, It is clocked in saying that Johnathan's car had left the office's parking lot at 11:38 p.m., meaning that he hadn't left the parking lot until 2 hours after he had made the phone call saying that he was leaving. There is also security cameras in the parking lot, however they are not great, so you couldn't actually see into the car and see if it was Johnathan driving or somebody else driving, or if Johnathan was alone in the vehicle, because the cameras just weren't great. You could see the car leaving the parking lot, but you couldn't see the interior of the vehicle. This case is just going to continue to get stranger as we move on in today's video. So after Johnathan had left the work parking lot, he then headed to Delaware for whatever reason. He was there at about 1 a.m. when he went to a ATM machine and he took out $200. Now, what seems to happen in a lot of these cases is the security cameras don't work, and that is exactly what happened in this case. The security cameras that were watching the ATM machine had been broken, so there is no proof that it was actually Johnathan taking the money out of the ATM machine. We don't really know whether it was him or it could have been somebody else who had been holding him hostage in his vehicle. This guy was literally driving all over the place. He drove through New Jersey, then he drove through Pennsylvania. He was driving absolutely everywhere, and seemingly without a reason. And I mean, if you did have a reason to drive over state lines like that, you'd think that you'd choose a better time to do it. Maybe when your wife and children weren't expecting you home, in the day maybe. This entire thing just seems really, really strange. But anyways, while doing all of this driving, obviously Johnathan had passed several toll booths. Before he went to the ATM machine, he was paying for these toll booths with his credit card, but after he had taken the money out, he was then using the cash that he had taken out from the ATM to pay these toll booths. And then at 5:30 a.m. on December 4th, 2003, an employee from the company called Senford and Weaver, which was a drilling company, noticed a car parked on the property that he didn't recognize. He walked over to the car to get a better look, and that is when he noticed that the front of the vehicle was in a man-made river that was located on the company's property. Thinking that this was strange, the employee tried to get a better look at the vehicle, and that is when he noticed large amounts of blood on the inside of the car. This was enough to alarm the employee, and he immediately called police, who arrived to the scene pretty quickly. When police arrived at the scene, they started to investigate the car, and that is when they found that there had been blood on both the driver's seat of the vehicle as well as on the floor. There was also cash thrown around the entire vehicle. How much cash exactly is unknown. There's a lot of varying answers to this online everywhere, so I'm gonna just assume that it was the money that he took out from the ATM that he had left, but the money was thrown all over the car. After searching the area surrounding the car, the investigators pretty quickly found the body of 38-year-old Johnathan Luna. But what makes this case so strange is that Johnathan again had 36 stab wounds covering his neck, his hands, and his scrotum. It was quickly determined that the wounds were inflicted by a penknife that Johnathan had been carrying around with him at the time. And this is the part in the case, if you're anything like me, that you are going to be absolutely confused as all heck. So it appeared to investigators that Johnathan's death was from drowning. They said that the cause of death was drowning, and that is kind of where they left it. And again, this is where this case gets very confusing, because the medical examiner has publicly stated that they believe that this was a homicide. However, nothing else further was pursued about that particular claim. An entire investigation should have been open in this case because it does resemble that of a homicide. Again, even the medical examiners thought that this resembled that of a homicide, but several of the investigators on the case, as well as just people in general, believed that Johnathan Luna's death was a suicide. Now, to me, in this case, that just doesn't add up. And maybe I'm not getting all the facts or I'm missing something, but personally, I just don't see that in this case. I could be completely wrong here, as I'm not a scientist or a medical examiner or anything like that, but I do recall hearing that you can only inflict so much pain on yourself. So for somebody to stab themselves 36 times just seems very difficult and almost impossible to kind of do to your own self. I mean, like, I understand if you had some kind of mental disorder or something like that, but Johnathan Luna did not have anything wrong with him like that. So I think that it would have been very difficult for him to have stabbed himself 36 times. I'm gonna tell you guys now why this suicide theory kind of came to light. However, I do just have to say that I couldn't really find much online confirming a lot of these things, and a lot of these things are just people speculating. So just keep that in mind while going through this. So many people have speculated that Johnathan Luna's life was not as it appeared. Many people think that he was really struggling at home and that he was also struggling financially. Some people speculate that maybe Johnathan was having an affair and that he was on trial or going through some kind of court stuff for stealing a large lump sum of money while he was working a case. Now, I couldn't confirm a lot of that information, but what I could confirm was that Johnathan was being looked at for stealing a large lump sum of money while working a case involving a bank robber. After people started to think that this case was very strange because it doesn't seem like a suicide, the FBI came out with a public statement claiming that it was definitely a suicide. They were 100% positive that this was a suicide and that Johnathan Luna had been completely alone that night, which is why they started looking at the suicide angle to begin with. But again, the medical examiner who was first on this case strongly believes that this was a homicide and that there is more to this case than we are being told. If Johnathan Luna had actually committed suicide, why would he choose a way that would be so difficult? I feel like if you're premeditating a suicide, you would pick something easier. I mean, I'm not really sure, but that just seems very difficult to stab yourself 36 times. On top of that, why would he have left his office without his glasses and his phone? Another thing is, why was he driving all over the place? There didn't really seem to be a reason for that. He went to the ATM to take out money, but the only reason he took this money out, it seemed, was to pay the tolls because he was driving all over the place. And it just really doesn't make sense. A lot of this case, it doesn't make sense. Why did he call and tell that person that he was leaving the office at 9:30, but he didn't leave for 2 hours? There are just so many things in this case that I'm like, why would somebody do that? So there are only really two theories in this case. One is that Johnathan killed himself. It's a cut and dry case, and there isn't anything to it except for he did all this really erratic and weird stuff and then took his own life. But the second theory has a lot of theories within it, and that is that Johnathan was murdered. What makes the murder angle in this case so interesting and what seems likely to me is because there was a second person's blood discovered inside of Jonathan's vehicle. Again, there was blood all over the seat as well as the floor of the vehicle, and when the blood was tested, allegedly, majority of the blood had belonged to Johnathan, but some of the blood that was in the vehicle belonged to an unknown person, and they've never been identified. So I think that that kind of confirms that Johnathan was not alone in the vehicle. However, the FBI believes something completely different. Johnathan, again, was an attorney. He worked a lot of very difficult cases with big criminals, and a lot of people maybe would want to kind of get rid of him. I feel like if you're in court, that kind of gives criminals and people whose minds don't work like mine and yours the idea that they need to get rid of you, and I think that it's very possible in this case that that happened. The theory that I found most interesting in this case involves the court case that Johnathan was working on. Again, this court case had high FBI involvement, and they were definitely trying to cover some stuff up because the guy that was on trial was their informant, and they had been kind of covering for him all that time while he was committing murders and all of these crimes. So people have theorized that maybe Johnathan knew too much. Maybe Johnathan was not prepared to stay quiet. He wanted to get this information out to the public, out to the courts. And so either the man involved in the drug ring or the FBI had him killed. To me, this theory just makes the most sense. Not necessarily that the FBI or the guy who was on trial killed him, but that his death was a murder, because so many things in this case don't make sense. But even looking at it from this angle, there still is a lot about this case that just leaves you so confused. Why drive over so many state lines? Why didn't he bring his glasses? Why did he leave his cell phone? Why was he staying at the office 2 hours later than he had planned leaving? Why was there money strewn all over the car? Why was he underneath the vehicle in the water? How did he even get under there if he committed suicide? There is just so many things in this case that just do not make absolutely any sense to me. My heart sincerely goes out to the family and the loved ones and anybody who knew Johnathan Luna. This case is absolutely so tragic no matter how you put it. Whether he was struggling and decided to take his own life or if he passed away due to some other circumstances, it is just absolutely heartbreaking and such a tragic end for somebody to face. And my heart sincerely goes out to the family who probably misses him and goes through so much pain trying to figure out what happened to their loved one on a daily basis. But guys, that is all that I have on today's case. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.